Hi, this is Paul over on Sam's channel. He has made a video. Our shirts match, sort of. He's made a video about moralistic therapeutic deism, part one. I mentioned that in a previous video. And the second video, does moralistic therapeutic deism still exist? I thought it was a great video. Now, I've got some nuanced differences from his and some commentary, so I thought, well, let's see how much time I have. Let's see if we can give this video the full treatment.
I'm going to be talking about moralistic
But first, let's set up the sound correctly. There, that should be better.
therapeutic deism. This is part two. See part one in the description. And this part is going to be addressing the question, does moralistic therapeutic deism still exist? All right. So just an overview, moralistic therapeutic deism was a term coined.
I'm not sure that's actually what his video is about. Because, well, moralistic therapeutic deism is one way to try to articulate the default religious water of America. I don't think it captures it that well. I think Sam actually captured it very well in this video and very well in the previous video, but that little segment that Christian Smith coined, it's pretty good, but I think it's a lot more complex. But go ahead.
Coined by a sociologist named Christian Smith. It has kind of five basic characteristics. There's a God who exists, who created and ordered the world and watches over human life on earth. God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other as taught in the Bible, but by most world religions. The central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life, except when God is needed to resolve a problem. Good people go to heaven when.
And again, I think that's quite good. And I think in some ways it sort of reaches its peak in the Cold War consensus. So we can sort of add that to this list. And I really liked Sam's first video. I thought there was a lot of really helpful stuff in it.
They die. And in my last video, I sort of complemented Christian Smith's definition by trying to give a historical explanation of how it came to be the case that if you interview thousands of US teenage millennials and you ask them what they believe about religion, you get something that looks like moralistic therapeutic deism. And my argument was basically it is American comic civil religion. It's basically a watered down pop Unitarianism with American characteristics. It's Boston to Buffalo in a blender from the years 1810 to about 1893.
Now, the Unitarian aspect is interesting because there are a lot of surveys about the divinity of Christ, and the whole Unitarian aspect is, as in most things with this, it's a very nominal space. It's not terribly theologically coherent. It's not terribly theologically informed. And those who do surveys probably are asking questions that people don't think about much. And I would say probably the divinity of Christ. If you'd ask questions about the divinity of the Holy Spirit, you probably have more heads sort of cocked to the side. Is Jesus God? Probably a bunch of people would say, yeah. So, but again, it's very low resolution. It's very low level. It's very nominalist on the part of many people.
And the six ingredients I said that were part of moralistic therapeutic deism were the Puritan morality coming from the Puritan Calvinist founders of the New England colonies. And that also provides a little bit of eschatology too. And then another ingredient was first wave Unitarianism, which changed the conception of God from being sort of a scary God that you fear to a benevolent God that you love and admire. Second wave Unitarianism, also called transcendentalism, took a spiritual but not religious view of religion and turned it into an individualized, intuition driven moral self actualization as opposed to worshiping an external God. And then another ingredient was the pragmatic therapeutic self help. with varying amounts of new thought, spiritualism, and metaphysical bookstore mismatch. But I mainly attributed this to the influence of Mary Baker Eddy, where the goal of self-actualization is now basically a form of self-therapy. I also added universalism, which is both the lack of the fear of hell, but also an emphasis on pluralism and perennialism. And then
And again, in my experience, most Americans, they don't disbelieve in hell. They just think that it's usually a meritocracy. It's good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell. Who exactly is good and who exactly is bad? Well, who exactly is bad? You've got Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and the neighbor with the barking dog. That tends to be who goes to hell.
sixth ingredient I said is American exceptionalism, or what I think really should be more accurately called progressive American covenantalism. All right. But then I asked at the end of my presentation, is moralistic therapeutic deism still a thing? Because the sociological research that gave rise to moralistic therapeutic deism as a term was done from like 2005 to 2008. And I said a lot has changed in the last 20 years since I was a teenager, because I wasn't in the study, but I'm the exact same age as someone who would have been in the study. And I feel like a lot has changed and that moralistic therapeutic deism is almost kind of dead. And so here's a preview of what I'll be talking about. I think that the things that killed moralistic therapeutic deism are gay marriage slash the LGBT rights movement, which sort of captured moralist, or sort of, I would say, ruptured moralistic therapeutic deism's connection to its Christian roots. Wokeness undermined faith in American progressive covenantalism. Globalism also sort of overrode faith or American centralism. But also, to be a little bit more bipartisan in my critique, I'll say that Donald Trump served as something like a wrecking ball, and another wrecking ball is the new Christian nationalism. All right, so the overall thesis of this video, if I'm just going to sort of walk through this and then I'll go into more detailed examples afterwards.
I really liked the nuance and subtlety of this image and its imagination.
There is a soft power that you can achieve if you make your ideas the background assumption in a pluralistic society. Having this soft power mostly requires a soft hand to avoid being noticed or named. However, the custodians of the background worldview can occasionally add ingredients to the tap water with big results. As the
Now, you'll hear Sam use a lot of agent arena language here, which I think is very helpful. And so with the water, he's giving the arena a sense of substance. And I think he's right that in terms of the arena, you've got to be slow and subtle.
diversity of the group within your fishbowl increases, the background belief system needs to grow increasingly vague and less specific to accommodate growing diversity.
Now, again, it was mentioned in the Charlie Kirk Memorial. Maybe I should just bring that up. Oh, I can't find it. The point is that, again, I made this in a previous video, that there's no talk of purgatory. It's heaven and hell, and it's, although there's some very clear substitutionary atonement preached at Charlie Kirk's funeral on the lips of people that I don't know if they're Protestant or not, but that's sort of the default. It's usually sort of merit. You merit heaven. And again, when I talk to people, just normies out there who don't go to church or don't go to church much, those kinds of ideas continue, and they've tended to be ideas that people pick up in movies, let's say.
The background assumption does often still have way more particularity to it than most people realize, often asking quite a bit of the groups it assimilates, but mostly it.
And I would say, to add a little bit more nuance, there, it isn't that necessarily there's a lot of structure to this, because there are definitely some ideas that are sort of floating around in the water, and particular ideas don't necessarily put people in opposition to the water. It's just sort of in solution.
tries to avoid overtly looking like it's asking any of the groups that it accommodates to make a change. The assimilation process works best when the obvious outward markers of a group that it is taking in are able to be left intact, but the deeper and less visible aspects are changed or replaced.
Now, one of the things I thought of a lot during listening to Sam's video the first time was how this sort of fared in the Christian Reformed Church. Because to the degree that the people of the Christian Reformed Church saw themselves as distinct from, let's say, default American religiosity. Default American religiosity would be sort of works righteousness, you merit salvation. And sermons would regularly counter that and say, no, salvation is by the free grace of God, given to us through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, something like that. So I think the Christian Reformed Church saw itself as sort of a something within the water, saw itself as distinct from the water. But I think Sam is right that people can't focus on too many elements at once. And so there might be a few elements that they sort of track, but it will be ministers and people who are looking to make a point that will maybe show that, okay, well, many normal people believe that it's works righteousness, but we here with a little bit more, we who go to church, we've had some catechesis, we listen to sermons, we define it. So then they'll sort of contrast, let's say, the religion that they read in the Bible versus the religion, the very nominal religious assumptions that are sort of out there in the world. And it's usually pollsters that sort of look at those assumptions out there in the world.
Moralistic therapeutic deism was and became the background belief system for America for a long time. I'm saying basically 1893 to 2009, although in a different part of this presentation, I'll date it to the end of the Civil War, even though it was still evolving. But even Christian Smith's ability to name and describe it.
The Civil War is very important here because these wars do shape. And if you want to have just a quick window into the prevailing triumphant religion, just look at something like the Battle Hymn of the Republic and look at the lyrics.
Showed that the fish were starting to notice the water by the end of the aughts. Unitarian Universalism / Harvard Divinity School. And most people don't realize that Harvard Divinity School, while technically non-denominational, if you read the fine print, is still basically actually the seminary of Unitarian Universalism. And so Unitarian Universalism / Harvard Divinity School basically tried to take up the role as the custodians of the background belief system, as opposed to really being a belief system in their own right. At first, it was something like a liberal, free-thinking pan-Protestantism, and then it moved towards a Judeo-Christianity to accommodate Catholics and Jews, especially during the 20th century, after large amounts of Catholic immigration and the Holocaust and World War II. By the late 20th century, it was become a pan-religious coexist to handle fully global immigration to the U.S.
Now, I think Sam's point is really good here, because part of what you see happening in the 20th century is this expansion. And what I really like about Sam's thesis here is that, okay, we've got to accommodate the Catholics. We've got to accommodate the Jews. In the middle of the 20th century, FDR, there is a national cathedral. This is why I usually go after Christian nationalism and call it dread Christian nationalism, because you look at almost every major university built before the counterculture in America, especially anything that was built in the 19th century, and you will find a cathedral at the center of the university. And it doesn't matter how woke or liberal these schools are, they have a cathedral. The United States has a national cathedral, and I haven't really done any research into the history of it. What you will probably find is people thought we should have a national cathedral, because you always have sort of this tension between, so we should have a, we're not going to have an official state church, but we really want this cathedral. And you look at American presidents and funerals done in this cathedral. It's Episcopalian. And again, if you go back, if you just use AI or something and go back and look at the formal religious churches of past U.S. presidents, many of them are Episcopalian. This was sort of the main line, and Sam will talk about this. And it's so helpful that he reminds me that, oh yeah, Harvard, yeah, they're UU. These are the religion. It was funny because Rick over at the House of Woo, Rick is often on the House of Woo, and I saw one of his comments that he had left, and he basically left what was pretty much kind of a liberal mainline posture in terms of, is it a perennialism? Not exactly, but it has many of these elements. There is no fear of hell, no jeopardy of hell. There are good guys and bad guys, but it's not ostensibly exclusively Christian. And this is where the open door, the secularity of the United States, and there ought not to be a religious test for those who run for office, let's say. And this came up, of course, when Amy Barrett, when she was, I'm forgetting her last name, sorry. But when she was getting grilled because she was one of Trump's nominees for the Supreme Court, this was brought up because people seem to be holding her to a religious test. And the Constitution is very specific. No religious test. We want it broad. So America keeps expanding it. And I think I really love Sam's ideas here, because as the tent gets bigger and bigger, certain elements in the water have to sort of retreat.
But it still had mostly Christian characteristics and an American centrism. And every time it grew in its ability to accommodate more groups, it also shrank in the level of specificity of its actual content.
So in other words, the broader it gets, the thinner it gets.
A challenge for the custodians is that every time they dilute the specificity of the content of the background belief system to incorporate more variety, the groups that are already here feel like they get demoted.
This is so important. That's such a powerful point.
To go from pan-Protestantism to Judeo-Christianity makes the Christian aspect of America feel decentered and less valued than it was before. Another challenge is these traditionalists don't like it when their belief system goes from part of the background belief system to just being another fish in the water. A risk to the custodians in this process is that the traditionalists will resist this new change and use their numbers to reassert their prior standing to try and make the background religion more specifically theirs again.
I think this is one of the better definitions of Christian nationalism, that we want the water to be more explicitly Christian. Now, I've done a little bit of digging since I made my video, and when you look at these people who will embrace the brand of Christian nationalism, and when you start to dig and say, well, what exactly do you mean by that? A lot of it's just sort of comes apart, because either they have ideas like a great ruler will emerge who will be both the religious and political ruler at the same time. Oh, I mean, I've just recently started another book from the same author, working on Pope Pius IX, and who was, of course, king over the papal states. And so he was the last pope that was both a secular ruler as king, a secular monarch, and leader of the Roman Catholic Church. And so some people are like, yeah, one of those rulers will emerge. And it's like, how's that going to work constitutionally? And you're going to overthrow the Constitution for this, because the founding fathers were pretty clear. They created an open system, but they created a system that it wouldn't be terribly easy to have a religious institution run the government as such. And again, in the last video, you have to look at, okay, is this an institution? This doesn't mean that people don't have religious ideas, or that people can't influence or politic for policies according to their religious ideas. And this is something that's often brought out, that, well, religious people ought not to politic with respect to their religious ideas. And it's like, it's just, say, so you have no religion, but you have supposed morality that you think comes from your reason or some other principle, and you'll politic on that, but not religion. That's gone. What the anti-Christian nationalism usually are emphasizing, well, we want a pluralistic situation. So it doesn't matter whether you go to church or don't go to church. It doesn't matter whether you identify as a Christian or don't identify as a Christian. Those things don't matter, even though, for the most part, it's been important to get elected in the United States to have some nominal tie to a church, even if you don't necessarily go to it. But I think, again, Sam's way of getting at this is really helpful, because, well, we want the water. I think many Christian nationals say, well, there's some policy points that we want to see reinforced. And this has been true for a very long time. Prayer in public schools, controls on abortion, and then a lot of ceremonial aspects to the United States. Does the government say, God bless you? Do we recognize Christian holidays? These kinds of things. But again, it's in terms of it's much more, we want the water we swim in to feel more Christian in the ways that we identify as Christian. And again, I think Sam's little template here is really good. I really liked it.
And this causes the custodians to put specific downward pressure on the specific markers of the traditionalists. This is why traditionalist Christians often feel like anything but Christianity pressure is put on their beliefs, where in the public sphere you can promote any belief except Christianity. The new identities are celebrated and given the red carpet welcome treatment. Meanwhile, traditionalists feel kicked to the curb. You can see this in like a Keep Christ in Christmas sign war. This is the traditionalists wanting to keep the specificity of the background religion tighter, as the custodians are simultaneously trying to loosen it. You can also see that there's a trade-off. As the background belief system keeps stripping itself of specificity, it becomes more powerful in some ways by incorporating more and more people. However, it becomes less powerful in others as it loses motivating power and meaningfulness.
That is such a key point, that there's power and specificity, but there are all these trade-offs. So you say anyone can come here, no matter the religion. And in fact, many institutions and organizations try this, because if you go to, let's say, a yoga studio, they'll say, this isn't religion. This is something else. And someone might say, well, doesn't that mindfulness that you're trying to practice in school, if I can't pray in school, why can we do mindfulness in school? Well, mindfulness isn't religion. Mindfulness is a practice. And again, this has everything to do with these particular ways at trying to define religion. And so you hope to bring more people in broader, but suddenly there's questions about behavior. And this is where we've seen this growth of HR departments, because as sort of implicit religious assumptions and norms get pulled back, then suddenly with those norms pulled back and certain behaviors crop up, and the people, because of their religious formation, begin to feel uncomfortable, then suddenly you have to wade in with other rules and laws. And this is where government grows as, let's say, religious practice and agreement recedes. And this is part of, I think, why we had this rise of managerialism, where, well, we sort of had these assumed religious behaviors and norms from at least, let's say, a Protestant least common denominator that we had, and then something happens. For example, the governor of the state of New York, who's now running to be the mayor of New York City, he is single and he has a first girlfriend, and then he breaks up with her and he starts asking out other young women who work in his office. Now, how does this work? How do we do this? Where are the rules? Or when Ronald Reagan was elected, there was a big discussion as to whether we should elect a divorced president. Now, I could pretty much guarantee you that the first divorced president would be a Republican when it's sort of assumed that the body of the most policing dominant religious communities vote for him. They're going to be the ones that have to sort of give the divorced president a bye. And the same thing happens with Trump. If you compare, let's say, Obama, married to one wife for life, if Obama had had a sexual history similar to Trump's, probably couldn't get elected. But because everyone understands that these are the sort of moral religious watchdogs, the irony is that in a system like that, they'll be the ones to elect the more immoral person and to basically give him a bye when everybody will scream about it. That's exactly what we saw with Trump.
Christmas becomes a winter holiday about snowmen and Jack Frost, but it's no longer the motivating story of the virgin birth of the Son of God. By the early 2000s, moralistic therapeutic deism was getting so thin that it was no longer providing as much meaning to its adherents. However, it was still pro American and mostly specifically Christian, with other special and honored guests within the Christian house.
Now, there are other marketing factors behind this too, because this particular worldview is imperialistic. Because in many ways, the shape of the American commercial empire is imperialistic. You're going to want to sell your Christian movies, your Christmas movies all over the world. And this isn't just, let's say, things coded blue, it's also things coded red. If you look at something, I made a little video about fear that I might just release to the membership channel. Didn't quite like it. It's really bad that I give the members the things that I'm not quite as sure about. But generally speaking, if you pump a lot of fear into the system, you'll tend to get people to be more conservative and more nostalgic. And so if you look at something like Hallmark Christmas movies, they're very nostalgic. But as Sam notes, they're also despecified. And this is part of the reason that, let's say, Christian movies, evangelical, message-based movies tend to get siloed over here. And I think Sam is exactly right on this anything but Christian thing. Again, I think this rubric that Sam is putting together is really super helpful, and it's full of a lot of, I think, really good insights.
But it was stretching to a breaking point of incoherence and nihilism. Let's see here. I'm going to play this clip of The Simpsons.
I think I'm going to skip the clip. Okay, she gets Unitarian ice cream, and there's nothing there.
All right. So why does Unitarian ice cream feels like there's nothing there? And the reason is twofold. Unitarianism snuck itself into the background religion so that it would be taken for granted, but it also stripped itself of any distinctives so that it wouldn't be noticed that that's what it's doing. A bowl of Unitarian ice cream is like offering a glass of water to a fish. It seems empty, but it actually isn't.
And this is part of what makes Sam's story, and he's going to get into a story a little bit later, Sam's story so interesting, because if Sam were a Unitarian Universalist, then people would sort of know what to do with him, and they wouldn't expect him to go to evangelical churches. But he isn't. He's a what he calls a biblical Unitarian, and so he coded evangelical, and then suddenly people don't quite know what to do with him because there's something in the bowl for Sam, whereas just sort of this vague nominalism, belief in God. And this is part of the reason, with Justin Brierley's The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Whenever I hear this kind of thing, I think just God is, it's maybe in England, it's more significant, but here it's pretty weak stuff.
All right. Chicago and moralistic therapeutic deism. Moralistic therapeutic deism emerges with all of its ingredients fully fledged at the Chicago 1893 Columbian Expo. Moralistic therapeutic deism reaches its zenith of power, but also its dying grasp with the election of Obama in 2008. Those are things I both argued for last time. It's also worth noticing Obama's presidential library is currently being built right on the exact site of the World's Fair of 1893. Although I can't help but notice that the architectural quality has declined a little bit. In 1893, we had these awesome looking neoclassical features that were built in like 0 seconds flat. And now we can barely build this weird brutalistic thingy that is way over cost and way over budget and way.
That is super interesting. You'll find Ezra Klein say this regularly in interviews.
I have of my own side. I think that Obama felt to many people like some kind of climax of the liberal project. If in this country, 4 years removed from the flag pin election of 2004, we could elect a man named Barack Hussein Obama, a black man from Chicago, then everything was possible. Now I think people, we take Obama so for granted, right? What that was so for granted.
Now, it's so interesting where he says everything was possible. And if you go later, when Douthit is pressing him, say, okay, what things? What things do you want? And it's openness. I was having a conversation recently where I was making the point that I made here, that if you pump a lot of fear into the system, you will have people get more conservative and more nostalgic. If people are feeling, if you want to, and that's sort of the Republican strong suit as the parties are sort of currently configured. Obama was sort of the last successful, really successful Democratic candidate. Why? Because it was hope. It was opportunity. It was blue skies. It was possibility. Possibility for what? Possibility for anything. But here's the difficulty. There's a lot of anythings out there. And then you get into this dynamic that Sam has just sort of talked about. Now suddenly anything meaning everything, well, everything can't work because things have to, there are these things called constraints. So again, I think I love this video by Sam. I think he did just a tremendous job. He's going to get into this.
After schedule, and at best it sort of looks like some sort of neo-brutalistic tombstone, but can't help but notice the irony of that. So like I said, I think Obama, his first term was some sort of zenith but also endpoint, and sometimes things are loudest right as they're about to die. For Obama, Christian was a Christian nation, but with a generous and welcoming pluralism. And Obama, especially in 2008, was putting a new emphasis on outreach to the Muslim world. This was, of course, in sort of counterpoint to perceived, discrimination against Muslims during the War on Terror.
Now, it's also helpful to remember that Obama grows up in the black church, and people have a lot of impressions about the Black church, but the Black church is astoundingly diverse because it's sort of segmented by race, and it's not segmented by confession. So you will find conservative Black churches, liberal Black churches whose pastors have gone to Harvard and other college and other have advanced degrees, and Black churches where the pastors have no theological education. The Black church is an extraordinarily diverse community with lots of different ideas floating around. But what they do have in common in many ways is what they've gotten in. See, again, I'm not entirely happy with, I'd rather call it the default American religion, because the latest biggest revival was the civil rights movement. And so all Black churches, sort of regardless of their theological confessions, will in some ways bend the knee to Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement. The Black church, part of the reason that the Black church works differently, especially in terms of rules about church and state, church and politics, the Black church can be very political, very, very political, is because for African Americans, the church was the only public institution they had access to. And they were, it was sort of an apartheid system. So you had Black churches over here. They ruled the roost. It was their institution. And again, because of the separation of church and state, the United States wouldn't regulate Black churches the way other Black institutions might receive government oversight. And so Obama comes in and he's tremendously articulate. He goes to whose law school again? Oh, yeah, Harvard. He's tremendously articulate. He's very bright. He's very charismatic. And there's a reason Barack Obama's campaign felt for many people eschatological. But as Ezra Klein says, well, and I remember listening and watching this rise. And of course, all around me, many of my African American friends and parishioners are just so excited because it was eschatological. Now, there are a few items with respect to Obama that, of course, are a little different because he's not a descendant of American slaves. His father was African and his mother was white. And so Colin Powell, also not a descendant of slaves from the United States, from the Caribbean. And so some of these, now as more and more African immigrants who didn't come here involuntarily and, through slave ships, it's very interesting watching these dynamics change in the United States.
In the aftermath of 9/11, America is, and for Obama, he very much believes this as much as anybody, at least he did in 2008, that America is in this progressivist covenant with God to be the locus of God's actions in history, manifesting providence. America can live up to this calling or it can fail to do so. And he kind of...
And this is where I've only just started watching Peugeot and Roland in their series on American symbolism. This is where you've got moralistic therapeutic deism, you've got civil religion, and civil religion is not exactly like moralistic therapeutic deism. They're really tied, but
like in his own person, embodied a post-racial America where the quality of character finally triumphed over the color of your skin. All right, so here is a clip of Obama running for president in 2008, being interviewed by the evangelical megachurch pastor Rick Warren,
who prayed at his first inaugural. And remember, Giglio because of his conservative stance on same-sex marriage, was disinvited to Obama's second inaugural.
Define marriage.
I believe that marriage is the union between a man and a woman. Now, for me as a Christian, for me as a Christian, it's also a sacred union. God's in the mix.
So marriage is a sacred union for Obama. As
Remember when I said having Father Josiah Trenum on that little post-Charlie Kirk, Tucker Carlson thing with his Cossack was so interesting? Of course, Rick Warren would have been a natural choice in 2004.
the Christian, marriages between one man and one woman, God is in the mix. And like, I think it's amazing. 2008, at least in my memory, was not that long ago. I think I can remember that.
In 2008, California passed a ballot proposition making same-sex marriage illegal in 2008. And a lot of people blamed African Americans for that ballot proposition's success in making same-sex marriage illegal. It's also important to notice that in terms of so I don't wear a collar, and I'm not wearing any clerical clothing. Now you're seeing more and more clerical clothing. Why? I think this has everything to do with Sam's sort of background and foreground arena relationship here, that people are feeling the need. I need to express my religion in visible ways so that if you're just seeing two people sitting across the table, one's wearing a suit and tie and the other one's wearing a clerical collar, you got to signal.
Interview. All right. So I want to tell a story from my time in college that I think is sort of a microcosm of a lot of the things that I want to talk about in this presentation. So I'm reading from the Cornell Daily Sun, the campus newspaper, and this is from spring 2009 when I was a sophomore on campus. A campus Christian group that receives funding from the student activity fee is coming under scrutiny after a student was asked by advisors to step down from its leadership team when he told them that he had openly accepted his homosexuality. This incident is also raising questions about the effectiveness of campus mechanisms for addressing instances of discrimination. Chris Donahue, 09, who joined the Chi Alpha Christian Fellowship when he was a freshman, said he had been openly struggling to reconcile his sexuality with his faith in Chi Alpha before he was asked to step down from the leadership team by Matt and Tracy Herman, the organization's pastors. The Hermans, both members of Chi Alpha at Missouri State University before graduating in 2002, became Cornell Chi Alpha's campus ministers in 2006. The leadership team consists of 12 or 13 especially dedicated students who lead Bible studies, teach, and are good examples. According to Danielle D'Ambrosio, class of 010, Chi Alpha's president, the leadership team differs from titled leadership positions because students do not have to apply to be part of the team. Before joining the leadership team, Donahue was vice president during his junior year. To enter a titled position in Chi Alpha, students must apply through the Hermans and demonstrate that they uphold certain values, including not engaging in premarital sex and refraining from drinking alcohol and taking drugs, according to Donahue. I thought it would be an awesome opportunity to be an openly gay man in a Christian organization, Donahue said. After Donahue finished his term as vice president, he was going to be on the leadership team last fall. The Hermans told Donahue that they were comfortable with his position as long as he did not engage in a relationship. However, after Donahue met his boyfriend last summer and affirmed his acceptance of his sexuality, the Hermans asked him to step down from the team without consulting the rest of the organization. I told them I've thought about my sexuality, and I'm 100% okay with my sexuality. I wanted the opportunity to show them I love God and I'm gay and it's okay, Donahue said. D'Ambrosio explained that Donahue was asked to step down because he no longer believed his sexuality was a sin and stopped actively working to overcome it, disregarding the Bible. The decision to ask Chris to step down was not that he did something wrong in having homosexual tendencies. It was because he no longer thought it was wrong. I support the decision fully, D'Ambrosio said. All right, now this is from a report from FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. If you're a fan of Jonathan Haidt, you'll be familiar with that organization. This is a I don't know, an article or a post that they wrote around the same time. Cornell University Assembly has voted to remove part of a proposed policy in the campus code of conduct that posed a significant threat to freedom of association, the Cornell Sun reports. After months of deliberation, the University Assembly passed a resolution this October to remove a clause from the campus code of conduct designed to prevent special interest student organizations from discriminating against certain groups in their criteria for membership. The resolution cited the need for more extensive debate on the interplay of discrimination, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly on campus. The policy was originally devised after Chi Alpha Christian Fellowship asked student leader Chris Donahue to step down from his leadership position in the group. Donahue had publicly announced that he was unapologetically in a gay relationship in contravention to the organization's beliefs. The University Assembly subsequently froze the group's funding, and after finding that the group did not violate any policies, funding was restored. But the policy change was suggested so that in the future, Cornell student groups could not take similar actions. All right. The Sun notes in May, FIRE wrote Cornell President David Skorton regarding the incident. We expressed our concern about the threat to freedom of religion, expressive association, and legal equality posed by the university's response to the incident. As we explained in our letter, an expressive organization, whether it's religious, political, or something else, must be allowed to limit its leadership to people who share the group's beliefs. The college Democrats must not be forced to maintain a leader who no longer is a Democrat or rejects various democratic political beliefs. A Muslim group must not be forced to maintain a leader who no longer believes in the tenets of Islam or that the group deems important. And a Christian group must not be forced to maintain a leader who no longer agrees with the specific Christian doctrine of the group. Following receipt of our letter, Skorton asked that a footnote be inserted into the policy to assure protection for free speech, freedom of association, and religious freedom. So, I mean, I remember.
Okay, if you go back to our Sam and Mai's Rando, this will come up. It's also important to note that the group itself gets to decide, that the university isn't going to decide who is a Christian, who is not a Christian. The group is going to decide. That's an important thing to keep in mind if something like this.
For all of this pretty intensely. I met Chris Donahue. I actually knew him not super well, but we knew who each other were, and we would wave to each other if we saw each other on campus because we were both very involved in the Christian fellowship scene. I remember the first time I met him being like, that's interesting. He's a leader in a Christian fellowship, and as best I can tell, he seems kind of gay. And it turns out that anyway, you get what I'm saying. I won't go any further with that train of thought. But it was interesting. You can tell that his Christian fellowship, which was not the same one I was in, was walking a delicate balance. You know, he knew that he struggled with same-sex attraction, and the leadership of the organization, and basically many other people as well, knew that he struggled with this, or that he had same-sex attraction, but he wanted to conduct himself in a way that was in accordance with Christian morality. And then at some point, he changed his mind and wanted to show that you could be Christian and gay at the same time, and it was okay. And he took a boyfriend and was behaving according to that belief. And that's what triggered him to be removed from his position. I remember there was also a protest vigil, I remember, that was hundreds of people on the main quad. And I believe it happened at the same time as Chi Alpha was meeting. And Chi Alpha was a pretty small group, right? It's the charismatic Christian fellowship group. And it had maybe 30 students or so in it who would meet regularly. And there was a protest of maybe, say, 300 or so students outside their meeting. And so it's interesting, you know, the protesters think that they're resisting power and oppression, whereas the Christian groups are scared because it feels like they're vastly outnumbered. They have almost no influence on the student assembly that's voting on whether or not they can get funding. So I think that this was a really interesting test case for a lot of the things that I want to talk about in this video, right? It's sort of the arena in many ways rising up against the Christian groups. I mean, this is obviously just on a college campus, but Ivy League college campuses tend to be the place where new ideas are tested out or embodied or enacted for the first time before they are then enacted and embodied at the national level when those students graduate and eventually take up leadership positions in politics and other areas. And as many of you who also know my story will know that I was in a leadership position of my own Christian fellowship, not Chi Alpha, but a different one, and that none of us had been asked to sign a statement of faith prior to this incident. We were just sort of, I don't know, sniff tested by the campus ministers. And if we,
And this is where you see that once things can no longer be assumed, now suddenly things have to be policed. And that heightening of policing is going to bring up all the more things. So things are going to get less implicit and be forced to get more explicit, which tends to be a facet of modernization.
we had, passed the sniff test after a certain period of time, we could be allowed into leadership. And then after this incident was getting moving, our campus pastor decided that it would be better legal best practices to have all of the leaders of my campus fellowship sign statements of faith, just to make sure we are all on the same page and stuff like that. And that statement of faith had Trinitarian bullet points. And I told the campus pastor that I could not sign this statement of faith because I didn't believe in the Trinity. He didn't know that beforehand and was quite surprised to learn that someone could look so much like an evangelical Christian, pass the sniff test, as I said, and then only later be exposed to show that he didn't believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. And so I was sort of quietly asked to step down from leadership. And there's no articles written about me in the student newspaper at this time because I didn't want to hurt the Christian fellowships. I wanted them to succeed. I didn't want them kicked off campus. And I was willing to sort of quietly take my demotion without my friends, at least at first, knowing why. And so this played a big part in my story. And in many ways, I feel like I'm still trying to wrestle with and work out what exactly happened to me at Cornell my sophomore and junior year. All right. But this also, like I said, marked a turning point in the life of moralistic therapeutic deism. While traditional Christianity had been asked to demote and empty itself of its prior place in American life, it was never asked quite so directly to change itself or be accused that it was specifically immoral.
So this is really complex, and you could really fill this out with a lot of nuance. So part of what happens is, of course, in Europe with what comes after the Protestant Reformation, part of the grand experiment of the United States is the American government is not going to police or work with churches on their confessional matters. And that kind of leads to an implicit materialism. Okay, so we can more easily agree on material arrangements than we can with certain metaphysical beliefs. But of course, practices then get a little fuzzy, and then you'd have, can prisoners use peyote if they say this to their religion, yada, yada, yada. But
the background religion shifts from being open and welcoming American Christianity to being explicitly post and anti-Christian. Traditional Christianity was now an awkward obstacle towards greater inclusivity. It was also considered morally wrong. In the attempt to kick the Christian fellowships off of campus.
And Tom Holland on trigonometry makes that point, because this openness, and I call it, say, progressive liberationism, this is sort of the water people are swimming in. And then what you see with the new atheists is they say, well, Christian churches are violating those assumptions. And so suddenly the Christian church that gave birth and got this movement going suddenly looks like it's out of step with it.
Campus, which ultimately failed in this example at Cornell, foreshadows the future leadership's desire to remove traditional Christianity. Basically, I mean, this pairs super well with Aaron Renn's thesis about positive world, neutral world, negative world. where originally Christianity was seen as a positive thing. To be a Christian, to belong to a church, to be religious was viewed positively. And then it became sort of a neutral thing, right? Sort of in that middle 20th century, later half of the 20th century, being Christian was like a good option among many other good options. But if you weren't Christian, that wasn't bad. If you were Christian, it wasn't bad either. But right around this time, it shifts from being a neutral world to a negative world. And the lightning rod issue sparking this is gay rights, gay marriage, LGBT inclusion.
Okay, now part of what's interesting in this is the utilitrads, those who will say, someone like Konstantin Kisin, who will say, well, religion is really important because it works. And this is sort of Jordan Peterson, Konstantin Kisin, a lot of people who are sort of around natural law. These utilitrads will say, well, no, there's a tipping point where if it gets too open, then suddenly things begin to cave. And many things that Christianity has brought to the fore, such as child labor laws, monogamy, ideas of age of consent and age of majority, that we're going to exclude children from whole bunches of complex, difficult adult arenas for their own protection. Children are protected in terms of their bodies, in terms of their sexuality. You have all of these things that children are to be protected from. Once, and this is part of the reason why debates about sexual education in schools have perennially been hot, and now with LGBTQ have gotten really hot. Questions about children transitioning. See, one of the things that happens in this sort of open space is there's very much a libertarian idea that, well, people should have the right to choose. And depending on if they're old enough, they should have the right to choose poorly, but they themselves have to suffer the consequences of it, and they're not necessarily going to get bailed out. And so you have this idea of sort of open space, freedom, but there are other things that people are not allowed to choose. You're not allowed to sell yourself into slavery. You're not allowed to, if you go to the hospital and say, my body image that I feel having two arms gives me a great deal of emotional distress. I would like you to cut off one of my arms, please, because my internal body image only has one arm. No hospital is going to do that because they're just not going to do it. My body image says I should only have one foot. Hospital is not going to cut off your foot, no matter how much you beg, how many consent things you write. It's not going to happen. And so while there is sort of this empty public space, it's not really empty.
Etc. Because if we need to include LGBTQ people and their sexual activity in our inclusive world, well, then Christianity, or at least traditional Christianity, can no longer believe in its old sexual ethic. It has to be asked to change its sexual ethic. And that's a big difference from being one fish in the bowl competing with the other fish to being told that there's something about you that's no longer acceptable in the new water. And so I'll play, I have to play this obligatory clip from
Okay, now what's interesting is he plays this. I've played this clip many times before. He's got it from my my Vanderclips channel, which is a little sub channel that I'll often, if there's just other clips, I have this channel that I throw clips on that I want to keep. What's interesting about this channel is not monetized, and it's not monetized on purpose. And what was so interesting is that Sam, who does not have YouTube Premium, was getting ads from this video, even though the channel is not monetized. Now, I often get questions about the ads on my video, and I explain often in the comment section that a few years ago, YouTube changed its terms of service, and it basically said it can put ads and as many ads as it wants on any video on its platform. It can simply do that. And the only difference, if your video is monetized or not monetized, is whether you get a piece of that monetization back from them. They will still play ads on it. So if you don't like ads, you can get YouTube Premium, or the audio only version of this podcast has no ads on it. And there's another network, Odyssey, another video network that this channel is mirrored on. There's no ads on the Odyssey network either. And there are other ways to deal with ads, technical ways that YouTube terms of service. So he gets this ad right in the middle of it for tires, apparently. And Keller's talking about proceduralism. I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna have to keep moving. So
interesting stuff from Tim Keller. Although if you've watched this channel enough times, you've seen that clip enough times, it's sort of hard to avoid. So let's see here. One thing I didn't mention last time was mainline Christianity. And a couple of you in the comments section sort of pointed that out, like, it seems like you missed an opportunity to talk about mainline Christianity. And so mainline Christianity comes from the name of a train line that was built in Philadelphia, among the first commuter train lines in the world in the 1880s. The Philadelphia elite left the stinky, dirty, dangerous city and built what we now call suburbs with safe, good schools and big yards. I live on the Chicago North Shore, which is named after the North Shore train line built around the same time and for the same reason. The mainline churches are Congregationalists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Methodists, Unitarians, and maybe Northern Baptists. All have their origins in England and would primarily be ethnically WASPs. Lutherans are close to being a mainline church, but their Germanic origins sort of exclude them. But just like how a train is led by the first engine car, Unitarianism was the engine car leading all the other mainline churches in a liberalizing direction. Each was following at a certain distance. The Congregationalists, especially the United Church of Christ, seemed to be first behind. Episcopalians were pretty close. Methodists and the Baptists might have been furthest behind. But nevertheless, the destination was the same. The self-emptying pattern that allowed moralistic therapeutic deism or Unitarianism to accommodate ever greater diversity was eventually asked of these traditions as well. While the vestments, buildings, and liturgical details might still distinguish the different kinds of mainline churches, the theology converged into the same moralistic therapeutic deism, mimicking Unitarianism at the front of the train. However, Unitarianism wasn't copying this from anybody. They were the inventor. It wasn't imitating anyone. It was inventing and disseminating this liberalizing trend as it went along. And basically, all mainline churches have become openly pro-gay marriage and pro-pride flag now. I think originally the mainline custodians of moralistic therapeutic deism hoped to maintain their place controlling the levers of power available to the background religion directors and accommodate the pride movement. But this seems to have largely failed. These churches are just plain dying demographically. The new cutting edge of the LGBTQ plus crowd doesn't really seem interested in going to any of these mainline churches, no matter how many pride flags they wave. It was just too obvious of a break from Christian tradition, and there was no way to be credibly, authentically Christian and fly the pride flag. I just don't think that's worked out for anybody.
I think to apply his thesis here a little bit, you're going, and Lyle Scheller made this point years ago. He's one of the early church growth gurus. He said, if your church is countercultural, it will grow. Why? Because your church has a reason for being. If your church doesn't have a reason for being, if there's nothing it is adding, or there's no function that the church is providing to you, it's not going to have much grit. You're not going to have much mission. There's not going to have much reason for this. There's plenty of good stuff in here. The link to his original video is below. I'm going to skip ahead because I'm running out of time.
Gave it birth. All right. I want to push back against in a direction that it seems like I'm going. My analysis might suggest that moralistic therapeutic deism is a left-wing thing, but I don't think that's really true. It's only kind of become true recently. Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans had much more direct role in the rise and spread of moralistic therapeutic deism than the Democrats did early on. And in the 20th century, Republicans and Democrats were equally moralistic.
And this is where I don't usually use moralistic therapeutic deism for this. I use a progressive liberationism, because that you have the progressive movement at the end of the 19th century following the Civil War, and you have all of these betterment movements. And I think part of this has to do with a rise in affluence, a rise in technology. There's certain things that better standards of living, better technology, better sanitation, and then we've seen this with birth control, they afford. And so people are liberated from old constraints that were understood as religious, but they were also there to sort of protect the community and keep it together. And if there's, let's say, a technological movement, then certainly, well, you can liberate people from these things. The washing machine, for example, is a tremendous avenue of liberation because washing clothes by hand takes a tremendous amount of time.
Therapeutically deist, as far as I can tell. They might mix the different ingredients together with different emphases and concentrations, but it's still the same ingredients. Ronald Reagan is honestly probably the best, most quintessential example of moralistic therapeutic deism that I can think of. He was born in 1911 in Tampico, Illinois. He grew up in Disciples of Christ, which is sort of like a liberal mainline version of the Churches of Christ from the Stone Campbell movement, which was pretty popular in rural Illinois. As an adult, he called himself born again, but he rarely went to church and was never officially affiliated with any denomination. He had the standard.
And, if you go back on Reagan things, you will see that Reagan it was very moralistic therapeutic deism, just belief in God, and Ronald Reagan, the lifeguard. You can listen to the Rest is History treatment on Ronald Reagan, but he is about the most moralistic therapeutic deist president that we've had. Now, Jimmy Carter, much more Southern Baptist, particularist. Reagan probably wouldn't fight you on questions of the Trinity. Jimmy Carter would espouse a pretty clear Trinitarian profession and confession.
Vaguely Christian American moral beliefs. He had a strong relationship with Norman Vincent Peale, who was the founder of the power of positive thinking idea, which is very similar to the New Thought ideas and Mary Baker Eddy, right? This idea that you can think good things and manifest them into your environment. Ronald Reagan frequently quoted City on a Hill and was a firm believer in the American progressive covenantalism. He was as firm a believer in that as anyone who's ever lived. His wife also dabbled in astrology, giving him a faint connection to the occult and the theosophical elements that I mentioned last time from Blavatsky. He is basically a perfect example of moralistic therapeutic deism. When Christian Smith wonders why all these teenagers born between 1984 and 1990 are moralistic therapeutic deists, he could do worse than to look at the influence of Ronald Reagan. My main point is that even recently, moralistic therapeutic deism did not have a clear partisan slant. So, arena versus agent. Moralistic therapeutic deism was in some ways intentionally crafted, but also organically shaped to be the background belief system of the United States. It serves as the arena in which the various belief systems, denominations, religions, and political parts operate. Managing an arena requires a different set of skills and goals than does being an agent within that arena. The managers of the Major League Baseball Association desired to help the sport be competitive and entertaining, which requires a focus on fairness. The commissioner is not trying to win the World Series. He wants you to watch the World Series. The teams themselves try and win the World Series. Moralistic therapeutic deism functions best when it is not noticed but simply assumed. However, that doesn't mean it doesn't have its custodians. The custodians might be a combination of highly positioned elites like professors in the Harvard Divinity School, but also popular figures like Oprah. But sometimes the arena starts to envy the agents. Sometime in the 2010s, it began to feel like moralistic therapeutic deism was less about being the arena and started feeling like an agent itself. The left wing's stronger connections to the elite institutions started to tempt them to bend the rules in their favor. It would be something like if the Yankees started to use their connection to the MLB commissioner to tilt the rules and the rulings in their favor. While in many ways the arena custodians have more power than the agents, there are some things that only the agents can do. Now I need to transition to talking about Donald Trump. While Trump himself still has many of the traits of moralistic therapeutic deism, he grew up in Norman Vincent Peale's church, which taught the power of positive thinking, like I already mentioned with regards to Reagan. Trump clearly believes in God, but he's clearly not particularly devout. He obviously doesn't belong to any particular church, and he definitely believes in American exceptionalism and greatness. However, his personal behavior directly clashes with Puritan morality. He was by no means the first president to have a not very Puritan sexual history, but he was the first public and unapologetic person to have such a history to run for president, and that was without precedent. Also, his gambling, he owns casinos, his cameos in porn films, he's on his third marriage, his complete lack of any form of humility, his conspicuous consumption. He calls it 2 Corinthians instead of 2 Corinthians. But yeah, he's also a teetotaler and very loyal to his family. So he has a lot of the characteristics of moralistic therapeutic deism, just not really the morality part. And Donald Trump was reacting to a growing sense that the arena's custodians were starting to feel unfairly tilted towards the left. Donald Trump's rise also greatly alarmed the custodians, tempting them to further use their powers to try and prevent him from winning, or after he'd won, to prevent him from effectively governing and using the power that he had won. This has created a vicious cycle in which Trump gains more power. The establishment resists him while tarnishing their neutral reputation and destroying public trust and eroding any sense of the boundary between the arena and the agents. But then Trump only gains more power as he reacts against this.
Now, arenic power tends to prefer to be unseen. Again, this is, I think, the strength of Sam's metaphor that he's working here. And to the degree that he and Trump violated a lot of assumptions, implicit rituals, practices. He did different things. And that then suddenly those who want to protect the arena, well, now they have to come out and act. And now also, if Trump wins, they appear impotent. That then is deeply unnerving for groups of people that felt, well, things were going in the right track. It was difficult again, however, to go back to Ezra Klein. Where would we go from Obama? Would it be, well, and again, quite simply, well, Hillary was put on hold by Obama, so now it's Hillary's turn. And so where you would go from Obama would be a woman president, because that would be sort of the next frontier in the liberationism. And it's interesting that the two candidates that Donald Trump beat both were female candidates. You didn't have as much of the sense with Kamala Harris that this was a fight against a woman. And so Trump really sort of breaks the script. And he is, it's Trump Ragnarok in many ways. And this, of course, is exceedingly unnerving, because all of these scripts were sort of built in. And how could this happen? How could he win? Of the Declaration of Human Rights, which Sam reads, and again, what there isn't there is any mention of God. And so God sort of passes into the background, and as with the last video, it's just good, bad, right, and wrong. We'll jump ahead again.
Is that from the end of the Civil War till now, America has had this shared arena with competing players in the arena. But I think we're entering a stage, and maybe we're already here, where we actually have two competing arenas. This can be especially dangerous because what governs the interactions between the arenas? Is it just the rules of nature? And that's why I feel like so much of like current discourse.
Well, and part of what happens, it's hard for people to sort of understand why Jordan Peterson and Peugeot and evolutionary psychology, why that hit the way it did. If you look at the Protestant Reformation, so you've got, okay, the Bible. Well, the Bible will be the text. You have, in the Middle Age, you have this turn to the text. Okay, well, here's this text. This text plus reason is going to guide us. And of course, the Radical Reformation says, well, no, this practicing this text will guide us. And you have this fragmentation of the church. You have this fragmentation of the arena downstream from the Protestant Reformation. So then you have sort of this renewal of philosophy. Now we're going to use reason or empiricism, and these are going to guide us. And basically that's what you have in the Enlightenment. We're going to use reason and empiricism. These things will guide us because they can't be doubted. And part of what we've learned is that we have no monarchical vision. We are not impartial observers of reason or the empirical surroundings. So that won't work. And so what you see with Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot and the rise of evolutionary psychology is that, okay, so there are other structures. There are structures of perception. And we're going to look at these patterns. We're going to mine mythology to look at the enduring patterns of humanity. And it's the patterns of us and the world together. And if we can commonly agree on those patterns from us and the world together, maybe then we'll have a basis for agreements of what the arena is. And maybe then we can go into the future together and not have bloodshed or fight. Now he'll play some from the Tom Holland trigonometry. He looks at these four paths that Tom Holland looks at, and then he's with Douthit, and let's see. If you haven't read Douthit on this, it's well worth reading.
Basically, this would stay faithful to charities and kind of go back to an earlier stage. Americans particularly relevant. All right, quoting Ross Douthit's recent column to give him even more time to talk. 8 years ago, religious conservatives made a bargain with Donald Trump and accepted the leadership of a flagrant immoralist as the price of protection against a then ascendant seeming secular progressivism. This is that rising progressivism, that rising secularism that Keller was talking about. The agonies involved in this political compromise fractured churches, divided pundits, and seemed to introduce a further crisis into an American Christianity already dealing with scandal, disaffection, and decline. But today, conservative Christians are eager to tell a different story. In Charlie Kirk's memorial service on Sunday, a gathering of political figures where politics was subordinated to preaching, culminated in Erica Kirk's extraordinarily moving message of forgiveness for her husband's killer. And it was a stage for a narrative of revival, recovery, conversion, and Christian strength. Trump was there, of course, and still very much his unchristian self. His off-script comments about his inability to feel anything but hatred for his own enemies were funny in the Trumpian way, but also plainly true. But the idea that the future belongs to a post-Christian right, a subject we've considered in this newsletter, seemed not just absent, but almost absurd. As the leaders of the Republican Party lined up for a memorial that doubled as an evangelical revival, complete with altar calls. In this scenario, rather than being a harbinger of a paganized American future, Trump himself would be seen as a transitional figure, an agent of destabilization who delivered the coup de grace that the nostalgia-driven moralism of religious conservatism 1.0, while clearing the ground for religious conservatism 2.0, a more intentional and mission-driven post-secular formation, in which case the Christian right's bargain with Trumpism would look less corrupting and more necessary. in the strange way that Providence writes with crooked lines.
And so what you're going to see is, well, now there's going to be increasing proposals for this is the arena. These are the rules. This is what is allowable. This is how we can go together. And again, what's interesting, and I think Michael Sartori is basically right here, it's fundamentally American evangelicalism. Why would evangelicalism be probably the way forward? It's the biggest tent. It already has a degree of pluralism built in. Let's say it's modern metagelicalism, because we're going to include the Catholics, we're going to include the Orthodox, but that's, in a sense, the proposal being put forward to America, because the idea was that, well, can we go past Obama? What then? What liberations will go? Now, it's interesting with Trump that a lot of times people try to put a bunch of different things on Trump, like, well, his treatment of women. But he does have high-profile women in his administration. Well, his treatment of ethnic minorities. But he does have high-profile ethnic minorities in his administration. In that sense, those aspects he's not forefronting, but he's just sort of assuming. And, you know, we saw this in Trump 1 and in Trump 2. But you see an attempt to sort of move into a different arena. And, you know, this will be, these changes of frame are going to be large, and they're going to take time, but that's basically what we're working on.
So what is this future Christian nationalism? I think it will be increasingly clear which side of this divide. Basically, I think that option 2 is only going to happen if there's a civil war, basically that post-Christian right figure, or it could be a post-Christian left authoritarianism as well. But barring option 2, where we have options 1 and 3 from Holland's list, where we've got woke progressivism, that is the rocket ship that has cut itself off from its rocket, or a Christian nationalism, which interestingly Konstantin Kisin chose as his favorite of the 4 options. I think as those 2 options become increasingly starkly different from each other, it will become increasingly obvious which side Christians will feel is the only place where they can belong. And that will be true not just of Christians, but of traditionally religious folks of many different persuasions. A God-family country with vaguely evangelical.
So if you look at, let's say, the Sikh are tending to line up with the Christians now, and the Sikh are sort of, many Sikh are sort of looking at Christianity and say, well, we kind of have that, we kind of have that, we kind of have that, and the Sikh are very, they're very patriotic. You see Hispanics lining up that way. Again, a good number of African Americans. And so what you probably have is a coalition for a new brand of forefronting, being more comfortable forefronting Christianity. Now, I've been a part of the Christian Reformed Church when this stuff was pretty heavily critiqued. And that's a fairly common way for a lot of religious groups in the middle of a larger religious, diluted religious environment to act. They'll want to put forward their particulars, but be able to live in agreement with the rest of the groups. And again, in many ways, democracy is set to do this. And it is, I think in some ways we are sort of back to many phases in American life where there are going to be revivals, where people are going to embrace a more nominal Christianity. And this will be messy. It doesn't mean that Republicans will just keep winning the White House. It doesn't. They don't. What it'll mean is that, well, Ezra Klein is in some ways already talking this way. Okay, it's one thing for Ezra Klein to talk to Ross Douthat, his friend from the New York Times. It's another thing to talk to Remick over at the New Yorker.
It is a good time to sit with people in their grief.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe very deeply.
And how maybe has it been misinterpreted?
I think you got to separate a couple things here.
Sure.
My view is that in the, let's call it 12 hours after somebody is publicly murdered, it is a good time to sit with people in their grief.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe very deeply that when you commit an act of political violence like that, it is an act of political violence against everybody who participates in politics.
Now, again, I've been reading or been listening to The Rest is History on the Irish War of Independence and the Irish Civil War. And unlike, let's say, the American Civil War, where you had these two armies, basically different state, I don't mean federal government, I mean armies sponsored by states, sort of battling. So much of Irish political violence was assassinations and ambushes and killing people in their beds. I mean, it was that kind of war.
I said in that piece, and I believe, right, that on that stage that day, Charlie Kirk was practicing politics. He was up there. He was arguing with people. I've heard people say, well, he's not really debating to find the truth. And of course not.
Mm-hmm.
He's a very, very effective practitioner of politics. He's trying to persuade people. He's trying to create content that will work in our attentional sphere. And I think something that we liberals have to reckon with is he had been winning. He and the people like him had been winning. They had been beginning to win on college campuses, and there's a big Gen Z swing towards Donald Trump. They were certainly winning on social media. You can disagree. I disagree with him profoundly. And still, find things in him to think that there's meaning to make out of it. I don't actually find this to be a complex part of it.
The critique of it was that you were, for sure, engaging with his practice of politics, of meeting people where they are, but maybe underselling what Charlie Kirk represented in terms of his positions about race, about, quote, Jewish money funding an anti-whiteness agenda, about his views about LGBTQ people, all kinds of things. What is your sense of his particular politics, with all due respect and sympathy for, I think we totally agree, a horrific...
Okay, that's Arenic. You see the Arenic there? That's sort of that's establishing the background.
A horrific act of assassination.
I think this is a weird critique, genuinely. Like, you know human beings, David. If in the moments after a murder or death,
right,
you go people and tell them exactly what you thought of the person they just lost, is your relationship to people who you're in community with.
Right.
And I do believe myself to be in a political community with people who cared about and loved Charlie Kirk, even as much as I'm very much on the other side from them.
Mm-hmm.
Would you go to people like that when they've just watched somebody be killed?
So Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example, wrote a piece in Vanity Fair, making very clear what had been a collection of statements from Charlie Kirk that was quite representative. Did you think that was unfair?
No, I mean, not to me, right? Like, I virtually agree with Ta-Nehisi on every view he has, and Ta-Nehisi's on my show this weekend. I agree with Ta-Nehisi on virtually every view he has on things Charlie Kirk has said. I agree with the things that you just said. It's bad. I have, as I wrote in my second piece, I have poured virtually every ounce of myself into preventing everything that Kirk poured himself into creating. I think that for more people than I had understood, the sense that we are in any way in community together, the sense that we are still in a place where we are all practicing and doing politics has already eroded. I think something that's very alive for me is a feeling that we are not that far from national rupture. So many things that we like to say, it can't happen here, have already been happening here.
And who do you blame for that?
I mean, I blame Donald Trump quite specifically for that.
Yeah.
And I think that the way he has acted in the aftermath of Kirk's murder has been a exhibition of virtually everything that is wrong and dangerous about him.
I'm in 100% agreement with you.
Yeah.
I watched a lot of that memorial service.
Yeah. What did you think of it?
I saw two remarkable things. I saw the widow of Charlie Kirk get up and do an extraordinary thing, a woman whose world has been shattered, whose family has been shattered, who's lost the husband she adored. Forgive the person who killed them. I mean, I don't know that I could ever be capable of that. And then who spoke later? Donald Trump got up and he said, I hate my opponent. I can't be like that. And it wasn't just rhetoric. It wasn't a tossed off comment. It was true. And that.
But what was interesting was that even in Trump's, and I thought Douthat nailed it perfectly in his Trumpish humor, what was true there was that her forgiveness was aspirational. And that's really important in terms of the background arena. That what she displayed is what we should aspire to do. And again, the fact that this was impressive is very important.
Expressed with similar, much less equivalent hatred.
I agree that Donald Trump is very unique in the way he radiates hatred. And I think you know this, even as you're pushing me on this. If you talk to people on the right, and I'm not talking about Donald Trump or people at the top of politics, I'm talking about the people in my life who ended up voting for Trump, that they felt in these years profoundly rejected. I do think this politics of deplorables was very real. There is certainly people, right, who don't agree with the things I believe in the world, right? They began to feel that the Democratic Party genuinely didn't like them. And one of my most strongly held views about politics, one of my most strongly held views about politics is that the most important question for a voter is not whether they like you, but whether you like them. If they're going to entrust you with power, the first thing is not whether they agree with you. The first thing is just whether or not they feel you like them and will take them into consideration.
But do you think any of that was centered on Obama himself?
Oh, there's no doubt.
Why?
But I think Obama...
But why? Because of his character?
Because he was black and foreign to people. But, and I'll ask you this question. Do you think Obama would have won in 2016 if he could have run again?
I do.
So there you go. Politics is about power.
Yeah.
And I think people have missed this. Politics is not about self-expression. There's room for that. It's not just about a dispassionate analysis of ideas. There's room for that. It's a lot of what I do, a lot of what you do.
Mm-hmm.
Politics is about building coalitions capable of winning power and making the decisions you need to do that. So I said recently in a podcast with my colleague Russ Stout that I feel that there's been a lot of fatalism among Democrats, right? They've just accepted places where they cannot compete. I said that I want to see, real decisions being made to try to compete in Kansas and Missouri and in Ohio, and then in red states, right? Meaning redder than that. I'd like to see us running pro-life Democrats again. When Obamacare passed, 40 House Democrats are pro-life. People got very upset about that. I get why, but I think it's worth thinking about this. Has it been bad for the Republican Party that Susan Collins, who is nominally for choice, wins in Maine? Has that been a weakness for them? Has it been bad for the Republican Party that Donald Trump welcomed RFK Jr. and all of his voters, everybody who liked RFK Jr., Joe Rogan, all the way down into their coalition? No, it has expanded their power. Trump built coalitions when he thought it would serve him. He is, among many other things, that he is a ruthlessly political animal. And I think there are things to take seriously in that we have begun to demean.
I hear you. Mm-hmm. The problem is, the difficulty is juggling these plates all at once.
Sure is.
Right now, you're talking the language of conciliation and broadening the scope and the tent, temperamentally and politically, of the Democratic Party.
Now, remember, that has been what gave the arena its power, broadening. And what the Democrats have been wanting to do is purify. And it used to be that the Republicans were the ones who were sort of in those purity spirals. And now the Democrats are in these purity spirals, and they're finding, they're not winning, and they're having difficulty winning. And now, again, this is a long thing. There's going to be winning back and forth on both sides, but it's over. The arena is set over long periods of time. Now, I may be all wrong with the metaphor I'm about to use, but I pastor a church with a lot of older people, and a lot of older people that are struggling with diabetes. And people then will come by and say, Pastor, I've been diagnosed as being pre-diabetic, or now I'm diabetic. And you can prick your finger and check your blood sugar levels right now. But then I should probably just look it up. We have AI now. Okay, I was right. Your A1C levels, pinprick, and you'll get sort of your blood sugar level right now. But your A1C levels will give you an idea of what your blood sugar has been over the last 3 months. And that's the one that doctors pay attention to, because, your blood sugar levels go up and down during the debate, depending on what you're doing and what you're eating and whether you're not eating and so on and so forth. But the A1C level will give you a much longer baseline as to, okay, what's happening. These kind of arenic transformations take a long time because we live in them, and new populations come in, older populations die out, and so we're going to see changes. And we're going to see changes that continue to be pluralistic. But as I've talked about before, Christianity has been infiltrating other religions for a long time and continues to do so. And so, again, I think generally speaking, we're probably going to see these dynamics continue. So, all right, that's enough. By all means, watch Sam's video, because I thought it was super helpful, and I think the metaphor that he's using, or the model that he's presenting, I think is a better one and it's a better one of sort of coming to grips with, okay, people want Christian nationalism. Well, what do they want? Well, they want, it's sort of like sugar in the water. They want their water to taste a little bit more sugary, and then they're going to see if that works for others. And there's already a lot of, a la Tom Holland, there's already a lot of Christianity in the mix, but we're at an interesting point now where, how will this go? So leave a comment.